Bienvenido a un nuevo evento de Cátedra Europa.
Good morning and good afternoon to those joining us from the United Kingdom. On behalf of the 24th edition of Cátedra Europa, we welcome you to the session, The Role of Culture in Finance, for which we have the special participation of Arman Eshraghi and Julie Gomez. We remind our audience that you can register your questions in the space offered below your screens. We will now leave you with Professor Julie Gomez. She's a professor and researcher at the School of Business at Universidad del Norte, who will be presenting our guests and moderating the session today. We welcome you all, and Professor Julie, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Welcome everyone to Cátedra Europa. Thank you, Dr. Eshraghi, for accepting our invitation to join our conversation on the role of culture in finance. Dr. Arman Eshraghi is a professor of finance and chair of finance and investment at Cardiff Business School. His academic research spans finance, accounting, and psychology with interest including behavioral finance, financial technology, and corporate governance. His work is published in some of the leading journals of the field, cited in the media, including the Financial Times, Washington Post, Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and Bloomberg, and contributed to handbooks published by Cambridge University, Wiley, Springer, and Routledge. Professor Eshraghi is a Shimomura Fellow of the Development Bank of Japan, Fellow of the Center for the Study of Decision-Making Uncertainty at UCL, Fellow of the Higher Education Academy, Director of the Cardiff Corporate Governance Research Group, and an advisory board member of FinTech Wales. He has advised several UK fintech and investment firms in recent years. Thank you once again for your valuable intervention. Without further ado, I give way to our guest. Welcome, Professor Arman Eshraghi.
Thank you very much, Professor Gomez. It is my pleasure to be here with you virtually, and I look forward to this presentation. I also thank you again for inviting me to your impressive Cátedra Europa program. So I'm going to talk about the role of culture in finance. Some scholars have called this indeed a revolution in finance research. More and more papers have been published in recent years on the role of culture in finance, and nevertheless, it is still quite a hot topic. It still invites attention from journal editors and from journal readers. So, although the issue of culture is relatively well researched in other management disciplines, for example, in organizational behavior, etc. In the field of finance, it is relatively new. And the reason for that is perhaps you could say that this is a continuation of behavioral finance research. Most of behavioral finance research focuses on the psychology of individuals, but researchers have come to the understanding that it actually makes sense to look at societies in aggregate to better understand what makes, for example, people from Colombia different from people from England and from the Germans. What does this mean for their financial decision making? So this is really the core topic for my talk today, and I want to give you some examples of research that has been done in this area. Let me start with this classic paper, which was published in 2011 in the Journal of Finance. It is called, as you can see, Overconfidence and Early Life Experiences. And although the paper doesn't specifically mention culture, what it shows is that the people who grew up during the Great Depression, which was the major recession of 1929, Later, those that became CEOs of American firms, they behaved differently in terms of their financial decision making. They were less inclined to borrow money, for example. They were averse to debt. And so the capital structure of their companies was quite different. They used to lean more excessively on internal finance. And the reason for this is that their early life experiences of themselves and perhaps their parents was seeing up close personally the painful experience of having debt through a period of recession. And that culture, if you like, that experience during their early years had an impact on their financial decision making when they became CEOs of large firms. So that's an interesting example of how our experiences during our early years could impact our behavior many decades later. But culture can also be ascribed to different professions. For example, people who come from a different professional background. For example, the military people. In the United States, there are many chief executives who have a military background, and it turns out that their financial decision making is quite different from the average CEO. They tend to be more cautious. They tend to avoid tax. They tend to have lower tax avoidance, for example. And so the military culture of the discipline tends to spill over to their behavior as chief executives, which is interesting. Culture also has an impact on our understanding of gender. For example, we do know that this is, again, a classic finding of behavioral finance research, that men tend to be more confident than women. And when it comes to overconfidence, men tend to be the majority of overconfident people. They tend to trade more, they tend to be more risk-taking. But that in itself is highly culture dependent. There are some African tribes, such as the Maasai tribe, you see on the picture on the left, that in those tribes, women tend to be more confident. They tend to be taller than men. They tend to be more risk-taking, and they tend to be more alpha. So interestingly, even accepted notions of gender differences are quite dependent on culture. Culture also has implications when it comes to your perception of luck. There are studies that look at the Chinese culture. As you may know, in the Chinese culture, certain numbers are considered lucky. For example, the number 8 is considered very lucky because the word 8 in the Mandarin language rhymes with the word that means wealth and prosperity. And on the other hand, for example, the digit 4 is considered unlucky because it has the same sound as the word death. Now, Hirschleifer has a very interesting paper which shows that if you look at companies which go public in China, they get allocated a random code by the government, an IPO code. And those companies which have more of the lucky numbers in their IPO code, they tend to perform better initially because more people want to buy their shares. So their IPOs tend to be more oversubscribed initially. But of course, that market overreaction then leads to a reversal because ultimately any bubble bursts. So the IPOs then underperform other IPOs by about 10% later down the line. So this is an interesting example of a clean identification of the impact of something cultural in the world of IPOs. Now, let me give you another example. You may have heard of the concept of loss aversion. So loss aversion is the idea that losing a certain amount of money is more painful than gaining the same amount of money is enjoyable. For example, if you think about how much losing $1,000 would make you unhappy and how much winning $1,000 will make you happy, usually losing $1,000 will make most people 2 to 3 times more unhappy than gaining the same amount of money would make you happy. And this is known as loss aversion. There are some interesting psychological reasons for this. We hate the feeling of loss, the shame and the guilt that comes with it. And people like Freud have even talked about that. But this loss aversion is also culture dependent. There are some countries, some nations in the world where this 2 to 3 coefficient tends to be even higher. So if I were to ask you which country in the world has the highest loss aversion coefficient, you may wonder about that. And the answer is Russia. So what you see in this graph is the country to the right-hand side. Russia tends to have a loss aversion coefficient, which is close to 6. So for the average Russian, losing $1,000 is about 6 times as painful as winning $1,000 is enjoyable. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have Australia. For the Australians, that ratio is something like 1.7. So they tend to be loss averse because the ratio is more than 1, but it is pretty low. And this might be very small, but you might be able to see your country, Colombia, here in the kind of in the middle with a loss aversion ratio of 2.5. So quite average, pretty average, in not very high and not very low. So that's interesting. So what drives that? So these are some of the questions we will be talking about later. So I hope I've kind of piqued your interest in a number of ways. Now what I'm going to do is to take a closer look at three papers that I have been involved in myself and my co-authors, and provide more ideas for researching culture when it comes to finance. So the first paper was this paper called "Does a CEO's Cultural Heritage Affect Performance?" It was published in a Review of Financial Studies with my colleagues, Louis Nguyen and Jens Hagendorf. So what we did in this paper is we looked at the United States, and of course, this is a country which has had many waves of immigration over the years from many countries, including, of course, the United Kingdom, Germany, Ireland, France, and of course, Latin America, Mexico, so on and so forth. So those immigrants over time settled down in different parts of the United States. For example, as we very well know, parts of Southern California, Texas, etc., tend to be more dominated by Hispanic immigrants. So, so what we did, the question was, does this cultural heritage affect the decision-making of CEOs? And what we looked at specifically was CEOs in the banking sector. What we showed was that if you are from an immigrant background, you behave differently when you become the CEO of a firm, such as a bank. And we showed that this cultural heritage has an impact on the performance of your bank and in your policy choices. So, of course, you could argue that apart from the Native Americans, everyone else who lives in the US is an immigrant. And that is true. But we specifically look at people who have immigrated more recently to the United States. And of course, this is an interesting way of measuring cultural heritage, because if you do a single country study, for example, if you look at, say, a country like Japan, typically most countries are culturally homogeneous. For example, Japan is a country which is very, very homogeneous. It hasn't had many immigrations in the past. And if you compare countries together, do a cross-country study, for example, comparing Germany with France, then if you compare financial outcomes, it is hard to attribute them just to cultural differences, because there are other institutional differences, other economic differences, other things you have to control for, other differences which are difficult to control for. Looking at a country like the US is a good empirical setting for measuring culture, because the economic macro environment is the same. The legal macro environment is the same. The only thing that might change from, say, California to Massachusetts is the cultural mix of the people who live there. Of course, apart from some state level differences, which we control for. So what we did in this paper is we looked at the CEOs in the banking sector. We used ancestry.com, which is a database of ancestry. So it helps you find who the parents are of a certain person. So we traced the names of the CEOs into this database and found who their fathers were, and then who their grandfathers were, and who then great-grandfathers were, until we found a great-grandfather, etc., who came from another country apart from the US. For example, this person had a great-grandfather who came from Germany. And therefore, we concluded that this person was a fourth-generation immigrant. So his great-grandfather, in fact, came from a country other than US, in this case, Germany. We could have done this, of course, through tracing the mothers, and the grandmothers, but it would be more difficult, because through marriage, the surnames change. And so it would have been more difficult to find out exactly who the grandmothers are. Anyway, so this was a lot of work, which our colleague did. And then we regressed the return on assets of the bank on a dummy variable, which was whether the CEO was a generation 2 or a generation 3 CEO. In other words, a recent immigrant. We didn't have a generation 1 CEO. In other words, none of the CEOs in the US banking system were born outside the US. They were all born inside the US, but in some cases, their parents were born outside the US or their grandparents were born outside the US, and so on. So we found this recent immigrants, and then we also had another effect, which was whether the state in which the bank existed went through a so-called regulatory shock called competitive banking. So that was a natural experiment which we used for econometric identification purposes. And then we had various controls for, banks, bank level, CEO level, location, year, industry, etc., etc. And eventually we found that, as you can see, the second generation and third generation CEOs, their banks tended to have higher return on assets compared to fourth and fifth generation CEOs when the state level regulation became competitive. So that was the shock. In other words, when the business environment becomes more competitive, the immigrants tend to do better. Why? Possibly because through the process of immigration, you learn how to be resilient, how to cope with change. And that culture, although you haven't immigrated, that your parents did or your grandparents did, and that culture of resilience spills over through the generations. So that's the behavioral story here. And we found that people from different cultures had different effects. For example, CEOs who came from a Polish culture, from Poland, they tended to have the highest ROAs, and then Russians, followed by Italians and Germans, and least British and Irish. And we think this is because the Brits and the Irish, they didn't have to adapt as much because they were immigrating from Britain to the US, so the culture was relatively similar. They didn't have to learn a new language, so they didn't have the same hardship that, for example, a Polish immigrant. And then in the paper, although I don't have time to go into that, in the paper we look at we deconstruct this into different attributes of culture, and we use a number of well-known cultural measures such as Hofstede and so on. And then we show that those CEOs who are more resilient, their banks, for example, tend to have lower credit losses because their culture is uncertainty avoiding. Or when they do a takeover, that takeover is more successful because, again, they don't like uncertainty, so they manage their risks very well, and so on and so forth. So in the interest of time, let me quickly move on to the next paper. In the next paper, which again has been published in the European Financial Management recently, my colleagues and I look at the culture of transparency. So what does that mean? There are new fintech platforms which allow you to observe other investors, and if you like, invest with them or copy their trades. These are called social trading platforms. I'm not sure how popular these are in Colombia, but for example, in the UK or in Europe, they're pretty popular, and these are some examples of them. These are some companies that do this kind of thing: eToro, Zulu Trade, Wikifolio. We work with one of them called Wikifolio, which is which has a German origin, and it started in 2012. And it's very popular in German-speaking countries, but also in the rest of Europe. So what are these platforms? Let's say you think you can be a good trader, trading stocks. So you go on, you open an account, and you start trading. This could be in your name, or it could be just a pseudonym, and you start trading, and everything is transparent. So other people who watch your account, if they like what they see, if they like your performance, they can invest in you, and then you can become kind of like a fund manager or a portfolio manager. For example, this person here who has the ID Trader Lady is now managing about 600,000 euros, right? So you don't have to have any qualifications. It's a completely open field. Now, the difference between these people and fund managers who work in investment companies, one difference is that here we have complete visibility. So everything is completely transparent. You can go and see what they trade. You can look into their portfolio and you can look into their historical trades. So everything is completely transparent. But in the mutual fund industry, usually the reporting is every quarter. So you have to wait 3 months in order to get a report. And then it's usually not all the trades. So if you want to work in a platform like this, what you do is that you first open an account and start trading. At first, it's trial. It's not public. But once you have gained confidence, you click a button and then it becomes published. And so that's the second phase. It becomes published, and then once at least 10 people have expressed interest in your portfolio, it becomes like a real portfolio. So you become kind of like a real fund manager. And all right, so with that background, what we look at in this paper is the disposition effect. What is the disposition effect? Disposition effect comes from loss aversion. Remember, losing money hurts more than winning money. So because of that, if you have a portfolio and some of your stocks have gone down in price and some have gone up, it turns out that the stocks that have gone down in price, you tend to sell them. The stocks that have gone up in price, you tend to sell them because you want to make a quick profit. But the ones that have lost you money, you tend to keep them because you're hoping they will rebound, right? So that means selling your winners, but keeping your losers. So we all have a tendency to sell the stocks that have gone up, but keep the ones that have gone down because we're hoping that they will go back up again. And this is because of loss aversion. It's a very common behavioral finance finding. Now, what we do in this paper is we show using a model for testing the disposition effect and having dummy variables for different stages in which the portfolio exists. We show that as the portfolio becomes more transparent, this disposition effect goes down. So in the test phase, where everything is kind of hidden, we have some disposition effect. But when the portfolio becomes published, when you know other people are seeing your portfolio, then the disposition effect goes down. You can see that from the coefficient here. And then when it becomes investable, which is the final stage, it goes down even more. So your disposition effect goes down by about 35% through these 3 stages. And what this means is that the transparency allows you to become a better investor. So in other words, because you know that other people are watching you, you make better decisions, right? So that's the main finding here. However, here is the cultural part. We look at different countries which run this portfolio, this platform, and then we thought, let's look at East Germany and West Germany. Of course, as you know, there is no East and West Germany. After 1989, the two former countries united. But what happens if we just looked at those investors which lived in what was formerly West Germany, and similarly formerly East Germany. And what we find is that everywhere else, we have a negative sign, but so in other words, the disposition effect goes down. But for East Germans, it does not go down. It actually goes up. And what then we concluded was that because in East Germany, historically, during the communist regime, they were under significant surveillance from the government. You may have seen films about that. There is a famous film, The Life of Others, which is about exactly that point. So they were constantly being surveilled. So that surveillance is kind of become an internal part of their culture. So even when their portfolio becomes transparent, they don't get any boost in their decisions, because they're already used to that feeling of surveillance or feeling of potential observation. So this was the behavioral story here. And then to test our hypothesis, we did look at different parts of Germany separately, and we found effectively it is the East Germany which is driving this strange result. And we even divided Germany to north versus south to do a kind of a placebo test, so a fake test, and we didn't find anything significant. So it was definitely East Germany which was causing that. And so we thought then another interesting data set, if we had, would have been to look at North Korea versus South Korea, because again, two very different countries, although you could say probably culturally more similar, but politically very different. And then formerly, as you know, during the Vietnam War and before, we had the North Vietnam and South Vietnam. So these could be interesting data sets for running similar tests. Last but not least, we have a working paper which is currently under revise and resubmit with my colleagues from Japan on corporate governance in Japan. And what we examine here is the Japanese culture. So what is special about the Japanese culture? Historically, Japan has been isolated geographically. As you know, it's an island, but also politically, before the Japanese Empire, it was very, very isolated. And even now, it does not receive much immigration. It's very culturally homogeneous, and it's a very different, distinct culture. For example, it's a culture which values order and discipline. You have some of the best queues in the world when you go to Japan. It's a culture which values conformity. It's a culture which values public respect. And for example, when officials are accused of wrongdoing, they publicly apologize on the TV, for example. So it's a very interesting culture to observe. So recently, Japan went through some corporate governance reforms. And one of those so the objective of those reforms was to improve transparency. And specifically, they used a new form of corporate governance called comply or explain, which is the idea that before comply or explain, there was a system which was hard regulation. There is a regulation and companies have to comply. But in the new system, there were some recommendations and companies could choose to comply or could explain why they don't want to comply, right? So it gave them more flexibility. And in fact, most Anglo-Saxon countries, most Western countries now use this system, but it was pretty new in Japan. So when the system came to the UK, for example, only 42%, British companies complied with only 42% of the regulations. In Germany, the compliance rate was about 22%. But what we notice is that in Japan, that compliance rate was 96%. So what this means is that for the Japanese, a regulation which was not a regulation, it was a recommendation. It was completely optional. Still, 96% of the companies, they just wanted to signal that they comply. So nobody, or very few companies, chose use their option to say, we don't think this regulation is good for us. We're not going to comply. So large companies, small companies, everybody complied in Japan. And so we look at the implications of this, and it turns out that this has very interesting cultural interpretations. The Japanese culture is a culture that values compliance significantly. It is an authoritarian culture. It is very vertical, very hierarchical. The level of individualism is very weak in Japan. And compared to the UK, as you can see, Japan is blue, UK is purple. Level of individualism is very, very low. Level of uncertainty avoidance is much higher. Power distance is much higher. So it's quite a different country compared to most Western countries. Managers seek to avoid shame. They value conformity, group membership. So what we found is that those companies which were the targets of the new policy, they complied. The regulation came into force in 2013, and you can see they chose to comply pretty quickly. But even those companies which were not the target of the policy, they chose to comply too. So it's almost like everybody falls in line, even though the policies, some of them were not appropriate or were expensive to implement, and they were just not very useful, but they did. One of those policies, for example, was the number of outside directors, which grew suddenly. And we later in the paper show that the number of outside directors had an impact on the performance of the firms. And so it wasn't a good choice for many companies to appoint new directors, and especially young firms suffered more. R&D intensive firms suffered more, but nevertheless, they chose to do that. And the results applied not just for companies that were listed in Tokyo, but also for other exchanges such as Osaka and so on. And then we thought it would be good to see whether our results are sensitive to the year in which the policy came in. So then we ran a placebo test, which looked at hypothetically other years, such as 2008, 2009, and we didn't find any significant results, which exactly confirms our hypothesis that it had to do with the introduction of the policy in 2013. So the main conclusion from this third paper is that social-cultural pressures can have measurable impacts on corporate policies and governance policies at the macro level, and they can lead to loss of value, especially when you ignore cultural differences. So a policy which works very well in the US and the UK, for example, if you implement it in a country which is culturally very different, like Japan, it is not guaranteed to succeed, and that's exactly what we find. Right, so I think my 40 minutes is up, and exactly I'm on time. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that I have given you something to think about in terms of the importance of culture in finance, and I would be very happy to hear your thoughts and answer any questions.
Professor Arman, there's a student that asks, have you researched the effects of social media on the personal finances of new generations like millennials and centennials?
Thank you for that question. Personally, we do not have a project looking at that, but I do agree with you that that's a very interesting area for research as well. What you're referring to is intergenerational cultural differences. And in fact, you're quite right that millennials and the generation that comes after millennials, which is Generation Z or Gen Z, the way they behave and the way they make financial decisions is quite different from, for example, the baby boomers. And so, so this is not so much about national culture, but intergenerational culture. And I agree with you, it is important. I would highly encourage you to conduct research in this area.
And I have another question, but this is me thinking out loud. When you were talking about those, I'm not sure what country it was specifically, but you were mentioning that they were very aware of people seeing if they were in debt or not. Like, what are they going to think about it? When we open the door for new types of technologies like blockchain, where your transactions are actually anonymous and nobody knows what you're doing with the money and what you are going to be using them for. And I'm pretty sure that things are going to get more secret or something like that. What effects do they have in people's choice? And are people like, if or have you ever tested, if nobody knows how much debt you are in or how you're using your finances, will people make different decisions? Will just be more aggressive with their finances and getting a lot of debt, or just be unaware of savings and be more reckless?
Absolutely. So we have a concept. This is a very good question. We have a concept in behavioral finance known as salience, which means to what extent something that happens in your environment is prominent in your mind. To what extent it sticks in your mind. It could be a memory from childhood. It could be something that is happening now. And part of that prominence, part of that salience is visibility of an event by the others around you. So you are quite right. If your debt, for example, is visible by the others around you, so it makes it more salient, and actually that might be a good thing because it could lead you to try to reduce your debt. But let's say you have a credit card nobody knows about, and you're running a high balance on your credit card. So you're buried in credit card debt, but no one else knows about it. That could be very dangerous as well. So the fact that something is visible by others or not absolutely has a differential impact. The paper you were referring to is the early life experiences paper published in the Journal of Finance, based on US data. So that was people who had seen their parents suffering from the Great Depression debt. And that's how this kind of stuck in their memory. And therefore, later when they became CEOs, they were more debt averse themselves. So in conclusion, I think the salience of the event will have an impact on how you perceive it and how this leads to different outcomes. But necessarily hiding it would not be a good outcome, as mentioned, for example, in the credit card example. Yes, so many of the decisions that are now made in the area of fintech, many of the trades are hidden, as you know. So you could have a wallet, cryptocurrency wallet, which is completely hidden even from your family members, and so that can lead to a lot less salience, and again, that could be potentially dangerous because it's something which is kind of in your unconscious, but nobody else gets to see that. Yeah.
And this is more of a personal question. Do you believe behavioral finances research should serve more government than financial institutions, or more financial institutions than government? How do you feel that they should shape the conversation? Because that's...
Well, I suppose from a from the perspective of serving social purpose, you could argue that if you could use insights from behavioral economics in the public policy domain, then the benefits to the end users, to civilians, to the citizens would be higher. But at the same time, financial institutions, which are mostly private, are benefiting from many of these insights anyway. And in many ways, these have led to introduction of or the development of better products and services for the end users themselves. If you think about it, the so-called robo-advisors, for example, or digital wealth management platforms, many of them use behavioral economics and behavioral finance principles when it comes to, for example, running a psychometric test to measure your level of risk appetite, and then recommending what kind of assets you should invest in, or how you should diversify your portfolio, etc. So these are concrete examples of using the principles of behavioral finance when it comes to managing your investments. And clearly that is again, in everyone's benefit to learn from these lessons. So I think both are important. They're not necessarily one or the other, they're complementary. But definitely their impact on the public policy is more macro and perhaps more important. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Professor Arman Shragi. That was a very interesting conversation, a very hot topic, as you mentioned at the beginning of your speech. And we really like this type of interventions, because they are necessary for all of us to understand how our culture and our environment influence our decisions in finances, in personal finances. Thank you, Professor, for accepting our invitation, and I hope to see you next time face to face.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. Thanks again for the invitation itself. Thank you.
We want to thank our guests for their special participation and all of our attendees for joining us in this session of Cátedra Europa. We invite you to continue supporting the education of more talented students through our scholarship fundraising campaign, Más Becas, by clicking on the donations button on the homepage of Cátedra Europa. We also encourage you to stay connected to the rest of Cátedra Europa's events today, especially this afternoon. We're going to have our Euro Caribe concert featuring the very talented students of our music program. So we're all invited, and we hope to see you all connected in our concert today. Have a good day.